29 missed calls from a number I hadn't seen in 20 years. I stared at my phone until the coffee in my hand went cold, and I never even pressed play because I already knew. Some part of me, the part that never really healed, already knew exactly who was on the other end of that silence. My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm 32 years old. I'm a graphic designer living in Denver, Colorado. And this morning, I woke up to a ghost. Some memories don't fade. They don't even sleep. They wait. They tuck themselves into the dark corners of an ordinary life, patient and still until one Tuesday morning, your phone lights up. And suddenly you're not 32 anymore. You're 12, standing alone in the middle of Union Station in Chicago, watching the only two people in the world who were supposed to love you walk away and laugh. Willow Creek, Illinois looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like: trimmed lawns, backyard barbecues, a middle-class family with a small chain of home goods stores, kitchen mixers, discount coffee makers, bedding sets, the kind of places that made ordinary life feel organized and safe. My parents were good at appearances. That was their real talent. My father grilled on weekends. My mother waved at the neighbors. And from the outside, we were exactly the kind of family people pointed to when they needed proof that hard work and good values still meant something in this country. Inside the house, it was a different world entirely. Inside that house, love was conditional. Safety was never guaranteed. And my mother had a word for everything she did to me. She called them lessons. If I cried, I was too sensitive. If I asked for help, I was helpless. If I forgot something, anything, she had a lesson ready to remind me that weakness was my fault, and my fault alone. My father never pushed back. He backed her up with a grin, like cruelty was something they'd built together, a hobby they shared and quietly enjoyed. When I was 8, I asked for a new pair of sneakers. My old ones were splitting at the toes. A normal kid request. A normal moment. My mother told me I was spoiled, marched me to a bench near the food court, said, "If you want to live in the real world, you can start by sitting here, alone, and learning that nobody owes you anything." They left me there for nearly 3 hours. I remember the smell of cinnamon and butter from the pretzel stand. I remember trying not to cry, because crying made it worse. Crying entertained them. When they finally came back, my father turned to my mother and asked if she owed him $20 because he'd bet I'd still be sitting in the exact same spot. She laughed. She actually laughed. When I was 10, I cried after a football game. A group of boys from school had mocked me in the parking lot, the way kids do when they sense someone doesn't have anyone guarding them. My parents drove to the far end of the stadium lot, told me to get out, and left me there after sunset. My mother's reason? Tears make people weak, and weakness attracts worse. I sat on a concrete curb with my arms around my knees, watching headlights disappear one by one, until they came back nearly an hour later with fast food for themselves and no apology for me. My father laughed, said he'd bet I would try to hitch a ride or beg a stranger for help. That was the pattern. Everything was a test. Everything was a joke. And I was always the punchline. The strangest part, they didn't think of themselves as cruel. Not even close. They used words like character, grit, real-world preparation. They wrapped ugly things in the language of purpose, as if the packaging changed what was inside. If anyone had ever asked them, they would have said they were raising an independent daughter. But they weren't building independence. They were building fear, hypervigilance, silence. I learned to read their moods before I opened my mouth. I learned how to disappear inside my own bedroom. I learned that if I was quiet enough, useful enough, invisible enough, maybe I could move through a whole day without being chosen for one of their experiments. The only place I ever felt real was on paper. I drew constantly, on receipts, on the margins of school assignments, on cheap sketch pads I bought with babysitting money. I drew bedrooms with locked doors, train windows filled with light, women standing on mountaintops with no one standing behind them. I didn't understand it then, but I know now what I was doing. I was drawing my way out of my own life. What finally broke? Everything was so small, so ordinary. I got a B+ in art class. Not math, not science. Art, the only subject that made me feel like I existed. I was proud of it. Right up until I walked through the front door and saw my mother, holding that report card like it was evidence. In a criminal case, how does a girl who spends every waking hour drawing still manage to disappoint me in the one class she supposedly cares about? My father said maybe I was getting lazy. My mother said maybe I'd started believing that effort was the same as excellence. That night, while I sat in my room pretending to study, I heard them in the kitchen. Voices low, almost amused. My mother said I needed a lesson I would never forget. My father said he'd bet money on it. The next morning, they were cheerful in a way that made my skin crawl. My mother made pancakes. My father asked if I wanted orange juice. They said we were taking a day trip to Chicago. Just the three of us, like it was something we did all the time. And for one stupid, desperate second, I thought maybe they were trying. Maybe the fight was over. Maybe this was the closest thing to an apology my family knew how to offer. I should have known better. The whole ride from Willow Creek to the city felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. My father kept the radio loud, drumming on the steering wheel like a man in a genuinely great mood. My mother kept turning from the passenger seat to ask me questions, the kind with no right answer. Do you think you're smart, Sophia? Do you think smart girls are ready for the real world? Do you think life cares whether you're scared? Every answer I gave seemed to amuse them. Every time I went quiet, they pushed harder. By the time the Chicago skyline came into view, that old, familiar feeling had settled into my chest, the one that told me something bad was coming, and I wouldn't be allowed to prepare for it. We parked near Union Station around noon. I had never seen anything that large or that loud in my life. The station felt like an entire city compressed under one roof. Businessmen with rolling suitcases, families rushing through in every direction, tourists, college students, all of them moving like they knew exactly where they belonged. I stayed close to my parents. I didn't know where else to stand. Inside the main hall, my mother pointed to a large pillar near the entrance. Wait here. We're going to move the car and grab lunch. 15 minutes, maybe 20. I asked if I could come with them. My father laughed so loudly that people turned to look. You're 12, not 2. My mother leaned in close. Don't embarrass me. So I nodded. And I stayed by the pillar. And I watched them walk away. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Then 45. I kept watching the big station clock, telling myself the parking lot was crowded. The food line was long. They got turned around an hour in. My chest started to hurt an hour and a half in. My hands were shaking. $9 in my pocket. No phone. No address written down. No idea how any of the trains worked. A 12-year-old girl in the middle of a city that did not know she existed. I started taking a few steps away from the pillar, then rushing back because they had told me not to move. And even in that moment, even with panic rising into my throat, some part of me was still more afraid of doing the wrong thing than of being left behind. The station got louder as the afternoon stretched on, and they did not come back. That was the day. Everything split in two. The girl I had been before that pillar, and the person I had to become after it. I never went back. Not that night. Not the next week. Not ever. I built a different life in a different city, with a different name and a future so far from them that most days I could almost convince myself they didn't exist anymore. But this morning, 29 missed calls from a number in Illinois proved something I had spent 20 years trying to bury. Then I saw our car, moving slowly past the glass front of the station, gliding like it wasn't in any kind of hurry at all. My body reacted before my brain did. I ran, both arms waving, heart slamming against my ribs, a 12-year-old girl sprinting toward a window with everything she had left, and they saw me. I know they saw me, because my father smiled, not the smile of someone who had finally found a lost child. Not relief, not guilt. The smile of someone watching a joke land exactly the way they planned it. My mother rolled her window down just far enough, leaned out into the Chicago afternoon air. I bet $50 you can't even find your way home. Then she laughed. My father lifted one hand off the steering wheel, a slow, stupid thumbs up, like he was congratulating himself for something worth being proud of. And then the car moved on, disappeared into traffic, and was gone. I stood at that window for a long time after the car vanished. There is a difference, a real, physical difference between fearing that something might be happening to you and watching it confirmed. Up until that moment, some part of me had still been holding on. Maybe the parking was hard. Maybe they got lost. Maybe somehow, this was going to turn into something I could explain away. That thumbs up ended all of it. My fear was not a side effect of what they were doing. It was the point. I was the point. A stranger brushed past me and said, "Excuse me," and the sound of another human voice snapped me back into my body. I walked back inside. I didn't know what else to do. I wandered from one end of Union Station to the other, crying in short, sharp bursts, wiping my face every few minutes, because my parents had trained me to be ashamed of being seen upset, even abandoned, even completely alone. I was still obeying their rules. I tried to think of someone I could call. There was no one. I tried to picture the route home. Home might as well have been another country. I sat on a bench, stood up, walked in circles until my legs ached. At some point, I stopped, waiting for them to come back. At some point, the waiting ended, and the abandonment began. That shift might sound like a small thing, but when you're 12 years old and you truly understand that the people who made you do not intend to collect you, it feels exactly like falling through ice. 3 hours. Long enough for the afternoon light to change color. Long enough for the crowds to thin and refill around me. Long enough that I stopped thinking in complete sentences and started moving on instinct alone. I stayed away from the exits, afraid that stepping into the city would make everything worse. I stayed away from police because my parents had always told me authority figures would make trouble worse. I stayed away from strangers because the same people who abandoned me had spent years telling me that asking for help was weakness. That was the cruelest part, I think. They had spent years dismantling my ability to trust anyone, then left me in a place where trust was the only thing that could have saved me. The person who finally noticed me was a station employee named Maria. She was in her 50s, with tired eyes and the kind of voice that makes you want to tell the truth even when you're scared to. She had apparently watched me pass the same row of seats and vending machines multiple times. She stopped me near a hallway by the administrative offices. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" I lied immediately. I said I was waiting for my parents. She asked how long I had been waiting. I said I didn't know. She asked if I had eaten. That was the question that broke me open. Everything I had been swallowing since noon came apart in one ugly, uncontrollable rush. I told her they left me. I told her they drove past and laughed. I told her my mother had bet money on whether I could find my way home. Maria did not tell me to calm down. She didn't check whether I was being dramatic. She crouched slightly so her face was level with mine and said, very clearly, "You're safe right now, and I am going to help you." I had never heard those two sentences said to me before. Not like that. Not by anyone. Security came first, then transit police. One officer took my statement while another pulled the station camera footage covering the front entrance. They confirmed I had been standing at that pillar for a long time. They confirmed that a car matching my description had slowed at the curb and left again without stopping. That mattered later. I didn't know how much, yet doubted the time. All I knew was that the adults around me had suddenly become very serious, very fast. Someone brought me water and crackers. Someone else wrote down every detail. My parents' names, our home address, the name of their stores, anything I could remember. Then they called my parents. I could only hear half the conversation, but I watched the officer's face change in real time, from cautious professionalism to open, undisguised disbelief in about 10 seconds. He asked if they were returning to Chicago immediately. Then he went quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something flat and deliberate. "No, ma'am. Leaving a 12-year-old in a major transit station is not a lesson in independence. It is child abandonment." My whole body went cold, not because the words sounded too harsh, because they fit. By early evening, I was sitting in a small interview room with a social worker while a report was being formally prepared. She explained it carefully, because my parents were refusing to return and still insisting the whole thing had been a parenting decision. I could not simply be sent home. There would be an emergency placement. Family court would review the case. I didn't understand most of the legal language, but I understood her face. She believed me. More than that, she believed I had not been safe long before that afternoon. Nobody had ever said that out loud before either. I was terrified when they told me I'd spend the night with a foster family. I had grown up on the stories the kind parents tell to keep children afraid of asking for outside help. But then I met Mark and Laura Bennett. They weren't glamorous. They weren't performing warmth. Mark was a photographer with ink stains on his fingers from handling prints. Laura was a preschool teacher who smelled faintly of hand lotion and classroom paper. Their house was warm and cluttered in the way that means people actually live there. A lamp on in the entryway, framed family photos on the walls, a dog bed in the corner, even though the dog was somewhere asleep in the back. Laura asked if I wanted spaghetti or soup. Mark asked if I preferred the hall light on or off, when I went to bed. Nobody yelled when I said I didn't know. Nobody made it a lesson. I cried at the dinner table after debates. Not from pain exactly, just from the pure exhaustion of no longer having to pretend I was okay. And nobody made me feel ashamed for it. That first night, I barely slept. Every car door outside made me flinch. Every creak in the hallway made me sit straight up in bed. But through all of it, one thought kept circling. A stranger at a train station had shown me more kindness in 5 minutes than my own mother had in years. I didn't have the language for what that meant yet. I only knew that the world suddenly looked different. And once you see that other people are capable of protecting you, you cannot go back to calling cruelty normal. The days that followed felt like living inside someone else's life, from the Bennett house to social worker meetings, to therapy evaluations, to a family court building, downtown, where adults spoke in careful voices about my future, like it was both fragile and urgently important. My parents arrived with a lawyer and the exact same energy they had always brought home with them, calm, offended, faintly, amused that anyone was treating this as a serious matter. My mother wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings as if looking respectable could erase what she had done. My father sat back in his chair, arms crossed, radiating the quiet patience of a man who expected to outlast the inconvenience. They didn't deny leaving me at Union Station. That was the part that stunned me most. They admitted it completely. They just insisted it had been controlled, educational, necessary. We were building resilience, my mother said. Children in this country have gone soft, my father said. Somebody has to teach them how the real world works. I sat across the table and listened to this. And something shifted inside me, something quiet but permanent. They were never going to understand what they had done. If they had been capable of that kind of honesty, they would have turned the car around before they ever reached the freeway. The court-appointed therapist's report used specific language. A pattern of emotional abuse, humiliation, neglect, escalating endangerment. Those words were not mine. I had never been able to arrange what happened to me into language that precise or that clean. But hearing them read aloud in that room, in a building full of people who were writing them down and taking them seriously, felt like oxygen entering a space that had been locked shut for as long as I could remember. Someone had finally named it, and once a thing has been named, it can never be made invisible again. The judge asked if I wanted to go home. I said no before he even finished the sentence. The word came out of me so fast it seemed to surprise even me. My mother stared across the courtroom like I had physically struck her. My father muttered something under his breath, something about ingratitude too low for the court reporter to catch but loud enough for me to hear. The judge didn't flinch. He had seen this before. What came next was supposed to be a path toward reunification. Parenting classes, family therapy, supervised visits, regular reviews. A structured 2-year program designed to give my parents every reasonable chance to prove they could change, on paper. It sounded almost generous. In reality, my parents treated it like a public execution. They hated being evaluated. They hated the oversight. They hated that teachers, therapists, and court officers now had a clear view of the face behind the fence, the one they had spent years carefully hiding from the neighbors. My father complained more about damage to the store's reputation than he did about losing custody of his daughter. My mother kept saying she would not let the state tell her how to raise her own child, and then they were given a choice. Commit to the 2-year program, all of it, everything the court required, or voluntarily surrender their parental rights. They chose surrender. Just like that, my chest did not shatter in that courtroom the way you might expect. It went strangely, eerily still. I had spent my entire childhood trying to be good enough, careful enough, quiet enough to stop them from turning on me. And in the end, when the choice came, they handed me over rather than admit they had been wrong. That was the truth that stayed with me the longest. They didn't lose me because the system took me away. They gave me up to protect their pride. After that, things moved faster. Mark started setting aside old photography magazines and art books, quietly, without announcement because he had noticed how often I drew. Laura knocked before entering my room. That sounds like such a minor thing. Until you grow up in a house where privacy is something to be punished for wanting. They learned which foods made me anxious because of old punishments tied to dinner. They stopped asking me to make eye contact when I was upset. They didn't demand love or gratitude or instant trust. They just stayed. Day after day. They just stayed. Steadiness can feel almost supernatural to a child who has never had it. The adoption was finalized after enough time passed for the paperwork to catch up to what had already quietly happened between us. When the judge asked if I wanted to change my name, I didn't hesitate for a single second. Jennifer Caldwell was the girl who had stood at a pillar in Union Station with $9 in her pocket, not knowing if she was alive or dead to her own family. Sophia Bennett was someone else, someone with a room of her own, a desk with actual drawing supplies, a family that did not laugh when she was afraid. The first night after the adoption was official, Laura put fresh sheets on my bed the way she did every Sunday. Mark left a new sketchbook on my desk. Nobody gave a speech about how lucky I should feel. They acted like I had been theirs all along. That quiet certainty healed more in me than any dramatic moment ever could. It taught me something I had never been shown before, that real love does not test you to see if you deserve it. Real love makes room for you before you know how to relax into it. Healing did not happen all at once. It didn't happen in a straight line either. People love the version of this story where the rescued child instantly blossoms the moment she lands in a better home. My life was not that story. For years, my body still treated kindness like it might be a trap. If Laura said she'd be back in 15 minutes after a quick run to the store, I had to physically fight the urge to stand at the window and watch for her car. If Mark was late picking me up from school, 10 minutes, traffic, nothing. The panic that built in my chest made my hands go numb. I hated waiting in public places. I hated being told to stay put. I hated the phrase, "I'll be right back," in a way that took years to fully explain to the people I loved. Therapy helped. But it was slow, ugly, honest work. The kind that forces you to say true things out loud until your nervous system slowly, reluctantly begins to believe what your mind already knows. I learned words like trauma, hypervigilance, emotional abuse. I learned that surviving cruelty over and over does not make you stronger the way cruel people claim it does. It makes you brilliant at detecting danger and terrible at allowing yourself to rest. Through all of it, the Bennetts never rushed me. They showed up to school events, remembered what topics set me off, let me keep my door closed when I needed space, and never, not once, made me feel like a project they were working to complete. They didn't try to erase what had happened. They helped me build a life in which it was no longer the only thing defining me. Art became more than escape. It became language, structure, proof that I could make something beautiful without anyone's permission. I poured myself into it through high school, then into college applications, then into every portfolio review and late-night studio session after I got into the Art Institute of Chicago. Going back to that city wasn't symbolic at first, it was practical. The program was exactly right for me. But somewhere in those years, I realized what was quietly happening. The same city where I had once been abandoned was becoming the place where I built myself. I was taking something back, one semester at a time, one finished piece at a time. After graduation, I moved to Denver, a branding firm, small business identity work. For the first time in my life, I lived far enough from Illinois that the geography itself felt like it was on my side. Eventually, I went freelance, then opened my own studio. I built a reputation for clean, honest visual storytelling, helping people say clearly who they were and what they stood for. The irony of that was never lost on me. My entire career grew out of the fact that I had spent a childhood trapped inside somebody else's lies. I met Alex at a housewarming party through a mutual friend. He was a software engineer, patient in a way that never felt performed, and very difficult to rattle. On our third date, I told him I had a complicated family history. On our fifth, I told him a little more. Months later, when I finally told him about Union Station, all of it, start to finish, he didn't interrupt, didn't overreact, didn't reach for some hollow line about everything happening for a reason. He just reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "That should never have happened to you." The simplicity of it nearly undid me. We built our life the same way I had rebuilt myself, slowly, deliberately, with room for honesty. We got married in a small ceremony. Mark walked me down the aisle. Laura stood behind me, fixing the back of my dress, trying very hard not to cry. We adopted a rescue dog named Max, a mutt with one torn ear and the cautious soul of something that had also been left behind too early. I blocked every account my biological parents ever used to reach me: Facebook, Instagram, Old email addresses. I changed my phone number once after a holiday voicemail from an Illinois number left me shaking for a full hour. I didn't talk about them unless I had to. I didn't visit Willow Creek. I didn't use my old name. Most days I could go entire weeks without thinking about Jennifer Caldwell at all. That was the life I had built by the time the missed calls came. A good marriage. A studio with steady clients. Morning walks with Max. Sunday. Calls with Mark and Laura. A life so quiet and whole that sometimes I caught myself wondering whether peace always felt this slightly unfamiliar to people who had spent years fighting just to reach it. 29 missed calls, then a voicemail, then an email from an address I didn't recognize. Then and this was the detail that made my stomach drop: a message request on LinkedIn. The one platform I had kept public because of work. Someone hadn't just found a phone number. Someone had done research. Someone had connected Sophia Bennett, graphic designer, Denver, Colorado, to the 12-year-old girl they had once laughed at through a car window. I sat at my kitchen counter with the phone in my hand. Max pressed his whole body against my leg, the way he does when something in the room shifts. Alex stood a few feet away, watching my face go white, and said nothing, because he already knew, from everything I'd ever told him, that this was exactly the thing I had spent 20 years quietly dreading. I had built walls, changed my name, changed my city, changed my number. I had done everything right, and still, the past had found a way through. 29 times. It had called 29 times before I was ready to decide whether I would answer. It wasn't my mother's voice on the voicemail. It was Hannah's, my little sister. The last image I had of her was a small girl in mismatched socks, padding down the hallway of a house she was too young to understand, too young to know why the air inside it always felt like it was waiting for something to go wrong. Her voice on that recording sounded older, rougher, the way voices sound when life has pressed down on them. For a long time, and not always gently, she told me our mother had late-stage cancer. She told me our father had suffered a mild stroke 6 months earlier. She told me the stores were gone, not struggling, gone, closed or sold at a loss, one by one. After the story, my parents had spent decades burying, resurfaced in the most humiliating way imaginable. It started with a single comment: my mother, in what can only be described as a stunning act of self-destruction, left a remark on a stranger's parenting post in a local Facebook group. Something about how children today needed stronger discipline, how softness was the real problem. One comment from a woman who had once laughed through a car window at her 12-year-old daughter standing alone in a train station. That comment opened a door she could not close again. Old neighbors started talking. A retired court clerk, who absolutely should have stayed quiet but didn't, hinted publicly that the rumors had a foundation in real court records. Someone found an old newspaper brief about a custody case tied to a minor abandonment investigation. Then a former store employee chimed in about what my parents were actually like when no one from the civic group was watching. The image they had spent 30 years carefully assembling collapsed in public, fast, and ugly. Customers stopped coming. People drove to chain stores in the next town rather than spend another dollar with them. Church friends went silent. Civic groups stopped returning calls. Willow Creek, the same town that had once protected them with polite silence and admiring glances, across a fence, turned on them, using the exact same tools they had always used on everyone else: gossip, judgment, closed doors. They had spent a lifetime perfecting those weapons. They just never imagined them being turned around, Hannah said. They were living in a subsidized apartment outside town now. No house, no stores, no standing, no version of the old family left to hide inside. Then she said the line that explained all 29 missed calls: they wanted me to come back. Not because they had become different people. Not because time had made them honest enough to face what they had done, but because they had run out of options, and they were terrified of dying without anyone who remembered them left in the room. I asked Hannah why she was reaching out. Why she was the one calling if she knew I had every reason not to answer. There was a long pause. Then, because I wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't lying to you. She told me she had cut contact too. Not 20 years ago. Recently, after becoming a mother herself, she had quietly requested copies of the court paperwork. She wanted to understand what had actually happened the day I disappeared from the family. Our parents had given her a version, of course, softened, reshaped, redistributed, that I had overreacted, that the state had overreached, that I had been manipulated by foster parents who simply wanted a daughter of their own, Hannah said. Reading the real records felt like being hit by a truck. She looked at her own small son after that and understood, with the certainty that only becomes possible when you are holding your own child, that she could never let people like that near him. Hearing that should have felt like victory. Instead, it just made me tired. Tired in a place deeper than anger ever reaches. She asked if I would come. I said I would think about it. Alex told me I owed them nothing, and he meant it without an ounce of judgment in either direction. Laura told me that whatever I chose, it had to be for my own peace, not for their comfort. Mark said it quietly, almost to himself. Some people only go looking for the bridge after they've already burned the house down. I sat with that all night. By morning, I knew one thing clearly. I was not going back to save them. I was going back to end it. In my own words, in my own voice, on my own terms. For the 12-year-old girl who never got to speak, I flew into Chicago 2 days later and drove the rest of the way. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and stale fear. My father looked older than I had imagined, smaller too, as if illness and disgrace had finally peeled away the performance and left only the ordinary man underneath it. My mother still had that carefully arranged face, even half sick in a hospital bed. Like dignity was something she could apply every morning alongside her lipstick, regardless of what she'd done. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother started crying before I had even sat down. Not a quiet, private cry. The kind engineered to pull focus to shift the room toward her pain before anyone else's could take up space. She said my name, my old name. I corrected her, once, calmly. Sophia. She nodded, pressing a tissue to her face. And my father said they had made mistakes. Mistakes. That coward's word. The one people reach for when the truth is too ugly to say out loud. I told them no. A mistake is missing a highway exit. A mistake is forgetting something at the grocery store. What they did was deliberate. They drove a 12-year-old girl to a city she didn't know, left her alone in a train station, drove past her panicking face, laughed, gave a thumbs up, and disappeared into traffic. Then spent 20 years crafting a story about discipline and resilience. To make sure no one looked too closely, my father opened his mouth to explain. I think, or to begin another defense wrapped in softer language. I didn't come all that way for another defense. You turned my fear into a game, I said. And the reason you are sitting here now, without a business, without your standing, without either of your daughters is because games end. People find out, children grow up, and truth catches up, even in small towns that have spent decades believing silence can bury anything. My mother asked if I could forgive them. I told her forgiveness was not a debt I owed to people who only came searching for me once their own lives fell apart. I looked at both of them and said the sentence I had been carrying in some unspoken form since I was 12 years old, standing at that pillar. You bet $50 on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just didn't come back to yours. They both cried then. For once, their tears didn't move me. That was the part that surprised me most about that room. Revenge, when it finally arrived after 20 years of waiting, didn't feel loud. It didn't feel hot or triumphant or cathartic the way I had always imagined it might. It felt cold, clear, exact, like setting something heavy down after carrying it so long you'd forgotten the weight had a name. I told them I would not be paying bills, managing care, or reopening any door to contact. I told them Hannah had every right to protect her child from them. I told them my family was in Colorado and in Illinois, with the people who had actually earned that word. My father asked if this was really goodbye. I looked at him, this smaller, older man who had once lifted a thumbs up from a moving car, and said, "It's been goodbye for 20 years. You're just the last ones to understand that." I stood up, and I walked out. 20 minutes. That was all it took to close something that had been open for decades. Outside, the air was thin and sharp and bright, in the way autumn air in Illinois always is like. The world had been scrubbed clean while you weren't looking. I stood in that parking lot with my hands shaking, not from regret, from release. The particular physical release that comes when something that has haunted you for 20 years finally has a shape you can walk away from. On the flight home, I thought about the little girl at Union Station, the one who had believed with every cell in her body that being abandoned meant being unwanted forever. She had been wrong. She was unwanted by two broken people who had mistaken cruelty for strength. But she was never not for a single day of her life unworthy of love. There is a difference between those two things. Learning it didn't just change me, it saved me. Abuse does not become discipline because a parent uses cleaner language for it. Humiliation does not build character. Fear does not make children stronger. It only makes them older, before their time. And walking away from people who hurt you, even people who share your blood, is not bitterness. Sometimes it is the most honest thing you will ever do for yourself. I did not leave that hospital feeling guilty. I left feeling educated by my own survival. The family you are born into can shape your wounds. It does not get to define your future. Real love does not laugh when you are scared. Real family does not run experiments to see if you can survive without them. Real healing begins the moment you stop calling cruelty a lesson and start calling it exactly what it was. And once you do that, once you finally do that, you can build a life so honest, so steady, and so full of peace that even the people who once broke you cannot touch it. Not anymore.